Welcome everybody to this evening's webinar. I've picked out some of the best bits out from our fundamentals course, Fundamentals of Dyslexia. So to give you a proper understanding of what dyslexia is and how it affects individuals. We will be doing a poll. So if just to find out what our audience is really. So if when the poll is ready, if you can just put that up for us, please, Nikki and Claudia. While you're doing that, I will just talk about what we're going to talk about today. We'll look at the differences between dyslexic and non-dyslexic brains. Oh, so the poll is asking, are you an educator, a parent or carer, are you a dyslexic adult, or another? So you'll just be able to choose one of those and submit, and we'll show you the results in just a moment. Yes, so carrying on, we'll be identifying dyslexia in different ages. So we'll go through the different kinds of things that you can be looking out for before you are diagnosed. I'll give you a quick experience of what it feels like to be dyslexic, and then we'll talk about dyslexia and the law. So just a few different kinds of topics and subjects to talk over this evening. Just a very quick introduction for myself. Before I worked at the BDA, I worked in secondary schools for about 14 years, and I supported learners who were dyslexic or neurodiverse. And I did lots of study, and now I'm a dyslexia specialist tutor. I can assess for access arrangements and diagnose dyslexia, and I've got a postgraduate certificate in SEND. So we're just waiting for the results of the poll. Okay, so we have 54% as educators, 28% as parents or carers, 10% dyslexic adults, and 8% as other. So welcome everybody, wherever you are and wherever you lie in our audience. So let's have a look at the differences between individuals who are dyslexic and who are non-dyslexic with regards to their brain. So it's well documented, isn't it, that through child development studies, we know that the more that we interact with a child from birth, all the way through their childhood and beyond, the more that we interact with them, the more the brain develops. But particularly, let's have a look at the differences between the dyslexic and non-dyslexic brains. So when we have these literacy acquisition skills, they are developed on the left side of the brain. So the left side is in charge of language, the right side is the more creative side. So the left side is helps us with our reading skills and ultimately reading and writing. So we have these three areas of the brain: the Broca's area, which is helps to produce written words, the parieto-temporal area, which helps us to analyze written words, and the occipito-temporal area, which helps us to identify written words. And then we also have the cerebellum. The cerebellum is at the back of the brain, and that is part of the brain that is responsible for making skills automatic. Now, this is for any kind of skill, as well as literacy skills. So what happens is if you're learning a new skill, the cerebellum recognizes that there is activity in the brain. It starts to build the neural pathways. And if you imagine it's a bit like a bridge from both sides, and they come together, and eventually these neural pathways will meet in the middle, they will fuse, and they will become completely automatic, which means you don't have to think about that skill anymore. So let's say you're learning to ride a bike. At the beginning, you're very wobbly. Over time and practice, you can ride that bike without even having to think about the skills that you are applying to it. The same for driving a car. You know, at the very beginning, it's very, very clunky. You probably make lots of mistakes. But eventually, after time and practice and skill, you're able to drive without even actually thinking about the gears or the how to read the roads and so on. And so you're able to multi-skills. You're able to sing a song on the radio or have a conversation. And it's very similar to literacy acquisition. So when the scientists looked at the brain activity in dyslexic and non-dyslexic brains, when they are learning to read and write, they found that the left side of the brain, for those who are non-dyslexic, had these three areas of the brain that were very active. The cerebellum could recognize that there was activity in the brain. It built the neural pathways. The pathways become automatic, and they don't have to think about that reading skill or that writing skill. They don't have to think about it. It's completely automatic. With dyslexic learners, however, because most of their activity is on the right of the brain and not the left, they found that these three areas were really quite still. And so what was happening consequently is that the cerebellum wasn't building the right amount of neural pathways because it didn't recognize the amount of activity in the brain. We can relate this to when we send our children into nursery, they go in and they learn through play. And they use all of their modalities and all of their senses to learn through play. They move a lot and they talk a lot, and they listen and sing and so on. And when they start to learn to read, as they get a little bit older, they're expected to use that multisensory way of learning less and less. So eventually they will go and sit in a classroom and sit and just listen to the teacher and expect to have the same kind of literacy acquisition. Now, what is happening is there is still when we see those gaps happening, it's because they've not continued with that multisensory way of teaching. And there's less activity on the left side of the brain. There are less neural pathways that have been built by the cerebellum. And we know, the scientists know, that if we introduce that multisensory way of teaching right the way through school, in all of their their activities, all the way through secondary school, all the way into adulthood, then when they are learning a new skill, as long as they are activating these areas of the brain independently with a different sense or different modality, there is enough activity on the left side of the brain for the cerebellum to make the neural pathways. So that's something to think about with regards to why there are gaps in attainment with some of our children. Dyslexics also have a challenge with their memory shelf. We all have a memory shelf at the front of our brains. Non-dyslexics can typically hold on to maybe 7 or 8 books on their memory shelf without too much overload. If it starts to get a little bit too heavy, things start to slide off. Dyslexics, however, may only be able to hold on to 2 or 3 books on their memory shelf, and it becomes overloaded really quickly. However, different books have different weights. So the pictorial images are very light and they're able to hold on to more information in those pictorial images than they are in the normal spoken or written sense. Stress, however, is very, very heavy and it can just wipe everything off all in one go, completely straight away. And I used to see that in secondary school when, I was supporting a learner in the classroom. They were understanding it. I was introducing multisensory techniques to explain something new to them. They were starting to understand it. But then teacher would ask them a direct question. All eyes are on them. Stress would knock everything off their memory shelf. And they're a bit like caught in the headlights. Um, and they can't find that information on their memory shelf because it's just been wiped off because of the stress. So that's what happens when with their memory, the short-term memory, the working memory, and so on. What also happens with our dyslexic learners, because of their left and right brain dominance, if you're left brain dominant, you are much more academic, lots of learning, literacy, numeracy, and things like that. The right side is very creative, lots of emotions, and so on. If you're left brain dominant, we also have our filing cabinet of knowledge here behind our left ear. That's where it's stored. If you're left brain dominant, you can get to that filing cabinet of knowledge super fast. It's a bit like driving down a motorway with no other cars. There's nothing to stop you from finding that information super fast in milliseconds. However, if you are right brain dominant, you have a longer journey to take to find that information in your filing cabinet of knowledge. And so it's a bit like driving down the scenic route. It's not to say that you're not going to find that information in the filing cabinet of knowledge. You will, but it might be slightly delayed. It might be that you have that pause, that slight delay if somebody's telling a joke and the punchline, and you're always a couple of beats behind everybody because you've only just processed that information. I used to see it in schools when in classrooms with the younger learners that I was with, they would shout things out. And, consequently, some teachers will chastise, our children for shouting out, put the name on the board. If they continue to do it, they get a detention. Well, in actual fact, what is happening is they are finally finding something in their filing cabinet of knowledge. They are putting it on their memory shelf. They need to capture it as quickly as possible. And the quickest way to do it is to say it out loud because otherwise it's just going to fall off their memory shelf. If you say to them, I'll come back to you in a moment, it's gone because it's just too much time has passed. So one of the things that I used to do with the younger learners, I was quite animated in the classroom, and I would pretend to catch what it is that they'd said. I would carry on with my own script and what I was talking about, but I would write it on the board behind me. And then when it was just at the right pause, I'd say, "Okay, why did you say that out loud?" And it might be they might say, "I was thinking about it from last lesson." And we go, "Right, okay then." And then I showed them that I was understanding why they were behaving the way that they were behaving. It wasn't because they were being rude, it was because they had finally found something in their filing cabinet of knowledge. For older learners, when I worked with years 10 and 11, I would encourage them to have a sticky note in front of them. And if that happened to them, rather than shout out or lose the information on their memory shelf, I would ask them to write it down on the sticky note. And then we'd leave a few minutes at the end of the lesson to stick all of the sticky notes on the front of the board, and we'd go back to them and discuss what it is that had popped into the head and why it had popped into the head, and hopefully make sense of the questions that they wanted to ask. Interestingly enough, though, for those older learners, I used to find that if there was two or three other people within the group and they could explain it in their own words to the learner who had written it down, I knew I'd done my job right because they were then teaching somebody else. So it's important to understand this processing, um, the information processing system, and to take the benefit from it, to try and use it to your advantage. So it was a way of addressing really who had understood what you were teaching them and who had not. So I've talked about difficulties with the left and right brain. However, there are some fantastic benefits of being right brain dominant. It comes with several unique benefits. It's often associated with creativity and holistic thinking. There are benefits, including things like that creativity. The right-brained individual tends to excel in creative tasks. It might be art, it might be music, it might be writing, it might be storytelling, and they can think of ideas outside of the box. They have these innovative solutions. They have a really good intuition. They often rely on their intuition and their gut feelings, which can be beneficial in that decision making and problem solving, especially if they're under a time pressure. They have an emotional awareness. The right hemisphere is really crucial for understanding and expressing those emotions. Right brained individuals are often much more empathetic and better off at reading non-verbal clues. They sometimes have that visual spatial skill, and that includes the ability to do things like recognize patterns and shapes and spatial relationships, which is very useful for careers such as design and architecture, engineering, sports. Okay. They have holistic thinking. Right brain people tend to see the big picture and understand how different parts fit together. If you have a team of people within an organization or a workplace, you have these different individuals who have their unique skill sets. There are some that really are very, very good at focusing in on the detail, whereas other people are very good at standing on the peripheral and seeing how everything is going to fit together and work together. And very often they can see problems that might arise even before they've happened. So this kind of approach can be very strategic, very advantageous in planning complex problem-solving skills, that kind of thing. And they're often very flexible and more adaptable to open experiences, to open and new experiences, I should say. And it leads them to be much more dynamic and flexible in their approach to life. So it's when we talk about dyslexia, it's not just thinking about the challenges that they are faced with, but also in the equally the benefits that can have the right brain thinkers can have. So the definition of an SPLD, so it's a specific learning difficulty. Okay, so let's have a look and split this up a little bit. It means that dyslexia only affects particular parts of that individual's overall learning abilities. It's very specific. And quite often it includes their ability to acquire these literacy skills. And it's important, this is important as an individual's ability to learn other things might be unaffected. Okay. Um, it's important to note that general or global learning difficulties are very different, and they refer to somebody's ability to learn most things and are usually linked to an overall lower level of cognitive ability. In simple terms, for learning, it means it's an individual's ability to understand something. It doesn't mean that they can't learn it. It just means that they have a difficulty in the act of learning it. And it's good news, although the initial process of acquiring some skills might be challenging, it's not necessarily impossible. And that's why I've put this on, because difficult doesn't mean impossible. It means you will have a different way of learning. And so instead of just sitting and listening to teacher in the classroom or in a training scenario, you might need to move something. You might need to say it or associate it with an image. All of these different layers of multisensory allows you then to be able to learn something. Let's have a look at the terminology. I want to address the incorrect terminology and provide you with something that is much more suitable in our society in this day and age. We used to call dyslexia a learning disability. Um, it's not a disability. It's not a term that we use in the UK in relation to dyslexia. Sometimes it is still referred to it in other countries. Um, a disability in the UK often would refer to somebody with global difficulties affecting all aspects of learning. And it would also include a lower level of cognitive ability. But many dyslexic learners and individuals will be offended if you use this term to describe them. So it's a learning difficulty or a learning difference. Okay, we're moving away from the word disability. I've heard people say to me they know somebody who suffers from dyslexia. In fact, many individuals actually quite embrace the fact that they are dyslexic because it comes with all of these strengths and their abilities. So there are many, many positives to being dyslexic. And word blind, thank you for the thumbs up. This term was first used more than 100 years ago to describe people who couldn't recognize it or to understand words that they were seeing. And that's because we didn't have the scientific evidence to really understand what dyslexia is. And so it was the scholars trying to describe it in the best way that they could. Nowadays, we have the science, we have the technology to understand what is happening in the brain and to understand dyslexia much more in depth. So that was more than 100 years ago. So we definitely moved away from the term word blind. We prefer to refer to somebody who is an individual who is dyslexic or an individual who has dyslexia. And it's really important here to note that the word individual in these definitions, and it's because we need to treat each individual with dyslexia exactly as that, an individual. And by putting the word individual before dyslexia, we are highlighting that the person comes before the condition. And it's very individual, isn't it? There are no two people with dyslexia who are exactly the same. So they have the same diagnosis, but they're not the same. They're the same, but not the same. They are absolutely unique. And it will be down to all of their own experiences, the amount of support that they have had in their early life, their mental attitude towards their dyslexia. It might be positive, it might be negative. All of the subliminal messages that surround them. You know, I talk to a lot of adults of my own age who had dyslexia and at school at the same time as I did in the 80s. And the attitude back then was that you were unintelligent. You were never going to amount to anything. Because you haven't got an exam, you've not passed an exam, you won't be able to do anything. You'd be stacking shelves for the rest of your life. When in actual fact, it was so misunderstood. And so all of these unique experiences will be a unique pattern of their own dyslexia. Um, if we just try to support dyslexia as a condition, we're likely to be a lot less effective than if we see each person as a unique individual and provide that individualized support. Now, there are some myths around dyslexia that we need to address, and it's worth addressing these head on. Has anybody ever heard somebody say dyslexia doesn't exist? Well, actually, it does, doesn't it? The scientists have proved that it does exist. Um, so some local authorities will not accept dyslexia when in actual fact it very much does exist. I can see there's lots of support with that because there's so many thumbs up. You must have heard that so many times. Um, there will be different definitions of dyslexia depending on who you talk to, but it definitely does exist. Um, and the scientists all agree on that. All dyslexic individuals are very intelligent. It's untrue. There's no correlation between intelligence and dyslexia, either positive or negative. And a lot of the learners that I used to support were very intelligent, and I could have some fantastic conversations with them, all the way from the gossip, what's going on the playground and the yard, to politics and current affairs and who was in 10 Downing Street and so on. And the difference was that the evidence wasn't on the paper. In internal assessments, in external examinations, whatever was going on in their head, it just wasn't transferred to the paper. And consequently, their intelligence wasn't reflected in their exam results. Likewise, as well, you can still have dyslexia and not be very intelligent. It might just be your genetic makeup. Okay, so again, there's no correlation one way or another. Oh, I hate this statement. Dyslexia is just an excuse used by parents when they have thick kids. Again, it's untrue. It's really unrelated to intelligence, and it should never, ever be used as an excuse, or certainly not a label for those who are not achieving. A dyslexic person can't read or write. And again, that's untrue. Those multisensory ways of teaching can be used to develop the brain. And so dyslexics can have actually a very good level of reading and writing. They just might not enjoy it. It's a chore. It's exhausting for them. They can do it, but it's just not pleasurable experience. I had a colleague who was a maths teacher who used to come and visit my groups all the time, and he was brilliant. He used to explain his dyslexia to the kids, And he used to say, "Do you know what? I've never read a book. Not because I can't, because I can read. I just don't like it. It's just too hard. It's exhausting." Um, and so, that is a myth that we need to bust as well. Things like if your emails are pretty well written, doesn't mean to say that you can't be dyslexic. It doesn't mean to say that, you can read the report that has been sent out from the boss. It just might take you a very long time and it's very laborious and it's not something that is enjoyable. Dyslexia and SPLDs are the same thing. Well, dyslexia falls under the heading of being an SPLD, but there are other types of SPLDs, such as dyspraxia, dyscalculia, ADHD, and so on. And it really does, it can co-occur with other SPLDs. So it's not unusual for somebody who is dyslexic to also be dyspraxic, for example. So there are these overlapping occurrences with dyslexia and another neurodiverse condition. Oh, this is a good one. If the words move on the page, you're dyslexic. No, this is a condition called visual difficulties, sometimes referred to as Mears-Irlen syndrome or visual stress or scotopic sensitivity. It used to be thought that if the words moved around, you were dyslexic. And the one thing that is going to help somebody who is dyslexic is to read through blue color, a blue overlay. That isn't true either. If you do experience visual difficulties, you will have your own experience of which color is best for you. But again, everybody experiences the words differently, uniquely. Some people say that the words move, some people say that they don't, but there are rivers running through the words. If it's a very white background, it's very painful to look at. It doesn't always mean that you're dyslexic. However, saying that, sometimes it can be co-occurring, it can overlap. So we can understand why that is thought. We know now, the scientists know that they are two separate conditions. If you have both, it's an overlapping condition. Oh, before I forget, if you go to an optician, the optician will assess the health of your eyes. If you are experiencing visual difficulties, you need to go to a behavioral ophthalmologist. Oh, I can't say it. Optometrist. Somebody needs to make sure that I know I'm saying it right. To diagnose those visual difficulties. And if that is the case, then they will prescribe coloured spectacles. So it's a very different kind of assessment. So in relation to other SPLDs, they do have some features in common, actually. The core difficulties and the causal nature of each of these conditions are, on the whole, different, and each SPLD has been classified to emphasise the differences that are principally associated with it. So if you think about dyspraxia, this is difficulties with fine and gross movement, potential for heightened sensitivity to texture, smell, and noise, potential issues with heightened emotional response. ADHD or ADD is a difficulty with concentration and attention. They can be very impulsive or they can be very withdrawn. Dyscalculia, it has, they have difficulty with the concept of number and numerosity, not understanding that 5 is a bigger number than 2. They don't understand that. Dysgraphia is a difficulty with the holding of the pen and the information, the thoughts from the head onto the paper. What you may notice with somebody with dysgraphia is that they move their whole arm to try and form the letters, and it's very, very painful for them. DLD, developmental language disorder, this is pretty much self-explanatory. It's that difficulty with that language and communication, word finding as well, that auditory processing. something called Asperger's syndrome, which is difficulty with social communication and interaction as well. And there are lots of them, lots of these are just the more common ones that you may have heard of. But this range of neurodiversity, um, we need to remember through language development, the terms might start to change slightly. So what I mean by that is the term disorder reflects the medical origin of the diagnosis. We need again to consider carefully when we're using this term when we're communicating with individuals. If we are telling them it's a disorder, that's quite a negative connotation. If we tell them it's a condition, it's part of you, but the individual comes before the condition. So we need to be very sensitive these days about how we are talking about these different conditions. So again, there's common issues with all of these when they overlap. It might be that they have a poor attention, poor working memory, time management, not just time management, but the concept of time. How long does it take to tie your shoelaces in comparison to running a marathon, for example? If you say to a child, you need to be ready in 5 minutes, and they go, yes, okay, mummy, do they know how long 5 minutes is? Um, it might have an impact on their organization as they become to get older and then going into adulthood as well. Sensory perception. They may have um, they might be very, very sensitive to different senses. And what I mean by that is if they, let's say they're working in an office, for example, and somebody has put in a plug-in air freshener, they may be very, very sensitive. That might really put them off for the whole day. Not because it's irritating them, but because the smell is overwhelming and it's removing the focus from the task ahead. It could be the same kind of thing if there is a buzzing in a light in the ceiling, or somebody's there's a tapping drip or a tapping drip, a dripping tap, um, something like that. So as all of these different kinds of sensory things can be really off-putting, and we need to be sensitive to that. And the speed of processing. So the speed of processing is the motorway versus the scenic route. Having that understanding that, don't ask somebody a question on the spot, allow them that thinking time. So as we go through the different ages, these are the different things that we need to be mindful of. When we're looking at children, the early years, the little teeny tiny people who can't always articulate what it is that they are feeling, they can't tell us why they behave in the way that they behave. We need to start to observe them and realize what it is that's happening with them. If they're having that challenge with nursery rhymes, remembering them and repeating them, there's not enough room on their memory shelf. And the same thing with paying attention. If you're not engaging them in a multisensory way, that it's or in imagery, you're not going to be able to you're going to overload their memory shelf. It might be that they prefer to listen to stories and really engage in them rather than looking at text. It could be that they are experiencing the visual difficulties early on, but of course they can't articulate what it is that they see. It could be that they have slow speech development. Now, this might not be to do with a hearing impairment. It could be to do with that auditory processing. If somebody's talking too fast, they will have to say what or pardon a lot, because they might need to hear it 2 or 3 times to join the dots to actually realize and understand what it is that is being said to them. So be mindful if a child is asking what all the time. The alphabet, there's 26 letters in the alphabet. There is 44 sounds that is associated with those 26 letters. There's absolutely not enough space on that memory shelf if they've only got space for 2 or 3 things. So the alphabet will be particularly challenging for them. If you're watching them and observing them in circle time with musical instruments, are they always a beat out of everybody else? Is that processing just ever so slightly out the same as, a little bit behind everybody else? Are they right brained? Are they going through the scenic route rather than the motorway to keep up with that beat? And if you're asking them to do something, if you ask them to do 3 things on the row, do they forget what it is? If you ask them to do 1 thing at a time, can they do it? More often than not, then they will. So it's understanding what is happening with the brain, understanding the behaviors, knowing to not get frustrated as the adult, and trying to really observe and understand the behaviors of the child. Something else that you might notice is that they might muddle up words, and that's because they haven't that phonological those sounds are not completely automatic yet. That poor auditory discrimination, I've already talked about that. Also look at the family history. Look at the wider family tree, um, because it is genetic. We know that. Sequencing, any kind of sequencing, if you're asking them to hold on to more than 2 or 3 things on their memory shelf, it's just going to be overloaded. And they will be very frustrated with their own abilities or inability to keep up with their friends. But also, if they're having somebody say to them, "I've already told you this. Why can't you do this? Oh my goodness, how many times do I need to tell you?" It's they are very negative um, things to say to a child who doesn't understand themselves why they are making you frustrated. And so it's important to remove those kind of phrases and replace them with, okay, let me see if you understood what I said, and give them a chance to repeat what it is that they are saying that you've asked them to do. As we go through primary school, remembering as well now that the gaps are going to start to occur if that multi-sensory way of teaching isn't um, continued. They also need that opportunity for overlearning. So once they've passed that phonics test, if they go into primary, it's very often, it's not always referred back to, but they need that constant overlearning and referring back to it. And so these gaps start to happen. So you may notice things like poor concentration. Are they going through mind movies? Do they see things in 3D that you're actually asking them to talk about? Do you notice that slower speed of processing? Do you notice that the instructions that you give them, they get muddled up? Do they appear to be very forgetful? When they start to learn to write, do they have that poor written work in comparison to their peers? Do they get confused with those letter sounds where once, they might have been able to regurgitate all of these sounds, but now it's starting to get a little bit more complex. They were doing first was learning to read, and now they're reading to learn. And if they are not able to decode these much more complex words in front of them, it's got these gaps are going to start. So we need to take a couple of steps back. And a poor pencil grip. You may notice that they use different hands for writing. I had a number of different learners who would write with one hand but lead with sports with the other. So that ambidextrous thing about them that you may notice. Poor organisation of thoughts. What is happening there is when they're writing down, it just doesn't follow any sense. It's on their memory shelf. They need to capture it as quickly as possible because if they don't write it down, it's just going to go. What we need to do if you have a child in that situation, lots of sticky notes, get them to mind dump. And then once everything is out of their head, reorganize it so that they can then rewrite it in the right order. Again, much more slower reading progress or syllable division. They're not going to be able to decode long, complex, multisyllabic words if they don't know how to divide the syllables. So that will need to be revisited as well. They will not be wanting to read aloud because they know that that is their weakness. And of course, if they're trying to decode each word as a single entity, the comprehension is going to be compromised. And so they might need to reread things several times. It might have a knock-on effect to their numeracy, things like sequencing of time and events as well. All of that is going to be affected. Continuing with primary then, more confusion with left and right, interdeterminate hand preference. Again, frustrated behaviours. They don't know, they're not mature enough to be able to articulate what it is that is frustrating them. And so if you see a child that is misbehaving and having a tantrum, you've got to dig a little bit deeper, really. It's not just the surface behaviors that is the problem. It might be that they like to be the class clown. That will probably be because of their personality, all eyes on me. But what they are really doing is they know that there's only a certain amount of time in a lesson. If the focus is on them and they engage teacher in lots and lots of talk and engagement in the lesson, there's less time at the end of the lesson to do that writing. They know what they're doing. And if they're great talkers, and very great showmen and show women, then they're going to use that to their advantage. Or the opposite might be that they are completely withdrawn because it's completely overwhelming. So bear that in mind as well. And extreme tiredness. If you imagine trying to decode every single word as a single entity, you having to read things 3 or 4 times more than everybody else, your brain is going to be exhausted when you get home from school. You're going to be absolutely shattered. And so for somebody who is dyslexic, they work in 3 or 4 times harder than everybody else in every single lesson. So bear that in mind as well. As we move into teens, a lot of this is repeated, but they start to mature a little bit, don't they? They get a better oral ability, especially if they're exposed to things like news and more advanced vocabulary, audio books, you know, listening to podcasts for geography, for example. They will have that better oral ability, because they will have been exposed to that ambitious vocabulary. It might be that they have poor handwriting. Again, they write very little because what they are writing, it takes so much effort to write. I used to see so many times, we need to expand this answer, when in actual fact, it's actually taken that poor child about 45 minutes to write 3 sentences. Um, it's unfair to expect them to do that. Taking notes is very difficult. It's a huge orchestra of skills to take notes. Their personal organisation may falter because all of their efforts is going into learning. They will hate reading aloud, because they know that they will be slower than everybody else. And it might be that they can read, but very slowly. Um, they will continue to need a ruler to read, and that's just to track the line so that they don't miss where they are. And that's okay. In my classroom, I handed out a ruler to everybody so that everybody was on the same playing field. And that was so that there was nobody that stood out at all. When they're reading, they may find it really hard to pinpoint ideas in a text, but if you give them an audio book, they'll be able to digest it much easier. Any kind of sequencing, again, number facts, science, physics, chemistry, all of these formulas is going to be really difficult for them to remember. They may have a very high level of intelligence of maths or science, but again, asking them to do what is 3 times 6, it's going to take too long to find in their filing cabinet of knowledge, so that it's quicker to get a calculator out. When they're in exam conditions, they may misread exam questions because their reading skills, they are under stress, they misread the question and they write down the wrong answer, even though if you asked them to verbalize it, they would be able to tell you exactly. And memorizing formula is very hard. If you had it in front of you, like they used to do during the COVID exams, it would be so much easier for them. And which brings me to exam access arrangements. If you know somebody is dyslexic, allow them to get used to software that will help them to give them that auditory explanation of answers, maybe even with a human scribe, but also with speech to text technology. If they're much more able verbally, then try and get them used to working that way. And then just to finish off with teens, that slow processing of information, the motorway versus the scenic route. They get very easily distracted because they don't really want to do the work. They become exhausted on top of all of the hormonal things that's going on in their body as they grow, and very forgetful of important tasks, um, which can be very frustrating to the adults around them. As they move into adulthood, we need to ask each other, do you confuse visually similar words such as cat and cot? When you read and write, is it fairly slow? What's your spelling like? Is it quite erratic? Do you find it hard to skim and scan text, or do you have to read every single word to be able to digest what it is that that text is trying to tell us? Do you need to reread paragraphs to be able to understand them? Is it hard to listen and to maintain focus? Do you have quite often that sensation of complete overload where you just need to go and have a brain break? Do you find it really difficult to concentrate if there are distractions? Even like if you're in an office environment, if something is distracting you, do you have that start, stop, start, stop cycle? Difficulty again telling left from right, north, south, east, and west. All of these get confused, several instructions all at once. Organizing your thoughts on paper, forgetting conversations, important dates. Do people assume that you are unintelligent because you've forgotten, or is it because of your dyslexia? Now, this is interesting. Do you find some tasks that other people find really hard, really easy, but then are unexpectedly challenged by what other people see as easy? Could that be your dyslexia? Do you consequently avoid certain types of work or study? Your personal organization, do you find that particularly difficult? Do you prefer somebody else to organize you for you? And consequently, do you have poor self-esteem, especially if dyslexic difficulties haven't been identified in earlier life? Are you only just realizing the challenges now because it's much more talked about? Is this something that you need to ask yourself? I've got a very, very quick activity for you because I can see the clock is ticking and I've waffled on quite a bit. I'm going to give you 1 minute. It does say 2 minutes on there, but I'm going to give you 1 minute. If you have a pen and paper, write about what you did yesterday. However, you are not allowed to use any words that contain the letter T or the letter I. Okay, off you go. While you're doing that, I'm going to carry on talking because this is very often what happens, especially in classrooms. We ask our learners to do something and to complete a task, but then we carry on talking and we're expecting them to multitask when the hardest thing is that you've asked them to write down the date and the title. It's really, really hard. I want you to realize, what are you doing? Are you trying to listen to me, or are you trying to focus on the task? Are you trying to block out either me? Can you not focus? What is it that you're doing? Can you find the right words if you're not allowed to use the letter T or I? So it's finding the right words. Check your sentences. Are they structured correctly? Do they sound very professional? Do they sound like the grammar is correct? And do you know what? That is a minute gone already. So what I want you to do is to just kind of like sit back really and ask yourself, um, how did I feel? Was I able to find the right words? Now, if you wanted to, you can carry on with that activity a little bit later. I've got to move into the next topic, which is dyslexia in the law. But I wanted you to just, if you wanted to extend that activity, you can do in small groups, and then talk about how you felt about could you find the right word? Was it frustrating? All of those different things. I'm going to move very quickly on now to dyslexia in the law. Otherwise, we're going to really go over time. The Equality Act of 2010 really does protect dyslexia. It's not because you're disabled, but it's because you have a substantial and long-term impairment, and it has a negative effect on your ability to do normal daily activities, such as filling in a form or reading a timetable, those kind of things. Substantial is much more than trivial. It takes longer to actually do something. And if you've got a physical disability, it's something like getting dressed. And long term, it means 12 months or more. Now, we know, don't we, that dyslexia is neurological in origin, and so it's a lifetime condition. So the additional needs in school, what I'm going to do here is I am going to just copy that and go back into the chat and pop that into the chat function and put that link in there. So this is the Education, Health and Care Plan that you need, which is on the government website. It's for all children and young people up to the age of 25 who need support, more support than is available really through the normal education system. They may be categorised as with special educational needs. When you create an EHC plan, your local authority will need to create a draft EHC plan and then send you a copy. You will have at least 15 days to comment, including if you want to ask if your child goes to a special needs or specialist college. And then your local authority has 20 weeks from that date and when they receive the request to give you the final EHCP plan. Okay. There's a couple of laughters there. I wonder if somebody's had a different experience, but that's what I found on the government website. There are budgets. If the payments are direct to the parent or carer, you can buy or manage the services yourself. The local authority holds the money, but the parent or carer decides how to spend it. And if there's a third party, somebody else will manage the money for you. And you can have a combination of all of these three options. If you're an adult and you need help with access to work, it helps that individual to stay in work if they have that physical or mental condition or a disability. But of course, it depends on that individual. Access to work will help to pay for things like practical support with work. It might be that they need support managing their mental health. It might be that they need help to communicate in job interviews. For example, if you are hearing impaired and you need an interpreter, for example. It won't pay for reasonable adjustments. So these are things that your employer must legally provide to make sure that and support you to do your job. So it might be that, you ask for a tint on your laptop, and that is very, fairly easy. It's a reasonable adjustment to be able to read through colour. It might be that gosh, I don't know. You might want to. If you've got ADHD, for example, you likes to stand up at your desk. You might have one of those up and downy desks so that you can focus and move about if you need to. All of these different types of things. I'm going to quickly whiz through what the BDA can do to help, because I know Nikki has gone through quite a lot at the beginning. So our website is our greatest resource, and if you do need access to that website, put my teeth back in, then we have this accessibility function here. And if you click on that, it will help you to read it aloud and change the colour and the font and so on. We do have our helpline, and this is operated by volunteers who are experts in the field. And we also have our email address and social media platforms as well. And I think, Nikki, very, very quickly, I've just kind of got about 3 minutes left to go back to you.
Yeah, we can squeeze in a couple of quick questions. I've got somebody asking if it had an assessment 20 years ago. Is it worth having another one, or does that one still count?
If you've still got the report, then no, you don't need to be diagnosed twice. You will been diagnosed. Some organisations ask for an up-to-date one, which is, you don't need to, but if you feel that your report from a child is going to be very different from what you are as an adult, then it might be worth getting an updated one. It's entirely up to you as an individual, really.
Okay, thank you. Any tips for helping with concentration in primary age children?
Concentration. Try and keep the disturbance to a minimal. I know that's difficult in early years provisions. What I mean by that is, try not to have too many things dangling from the ceiling, because they're going to be, trying to pay attention to them rather than to the actual lesson, and so on. Small groups, because the smaller the group, the more comfortable they will be, the more able they'll be able to hear you and to have that audio processing as well. So small groups, try and have a little as much distraction as possible.
Thank you. Great advice. I've got a couple of people asking about how do they actually go about getting an assessment if they believe they're dyslexic. For
Okay,
any
so
age.
yeah,
I've had some asking about teenagers, some asking about primary, but it doesn't actually matter. It's the same process, isn't it? So if you wouldn't mind just explaining what they need to do.
Yes, of course. If you go into the BDO website, you can search for assessments. I think it's in services. Is it services?
I think so. Yeah.
I think so. And just let us know if where you are. There's a form to fill in, and just send it off. And what we will do is we will look who's in your local area. We have a bank of people who have been vetted. We know that they have the right qualifications. We know that they've had up-to-date training and CPD. And we know that they've got the right insurance and they're members of the correct bodies. So we know that the people that we send to you are going to be, you're going to get a quality report from them.
Great, thanks, Matt. I know Claudia's just put the link on there as well. We were right, it was under services, but there is so much information on there. Somebody's asking about how to become an assessor. Do visit the website. There's lots of information on there. We have actually run out of time, unfortunately. If you did ask a question tonight and we didn't get to it, as Amanda said, we do have our helpline. You can email in, you can call in, whatever you prefer, what's easiest for you. And we have great volunteers that will come back to you about your individual questions about, some people have been asking about their children who are struggling, or somebody's asking about how to get support in the workplace. As Amanda said, there's loads of information on the website, but if you have a specific question to yourself, then just use the helpline. That's exactly what they're there for. I just wanted to mention, I said at the beginning that this is one of 2 webinars we're running this week. Amanda is kindly giving up her Wednesday evening, and we have one running on multisensory learning, so using multiple senses to enhance learning experiences. That is also for all age groups, so that is we'll be covering young children right through to adults with dyslexia. So if that's of interest, do exactly the same as you did tonight. Go on the website, just register for free, and you'll be sent the link to join. And on there we also have information about the next education webinar series, which is starting in a couple of weeks, I believe. And that separates it down. So each session, we've got one on early years, one on primary, secondary, and employees or employers in the workplace. So have a look on the website. I'm sure you'll find something that's of interest. They're all free. We'd love to see you all again. And just leaves me to say thank you so much, Amanda. Amazing webinar again. Thank you, Claudia, in the background, for doing all the information. And we'll hopefully see you on another webinar soon. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Good evening. Bye.
Take care.